Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair, and I want to thank the sponsor who, as the chairwoman said, couldn't be here, but let us go on without her and hope she feels better soon. I'm here to express on behalf of Common Cause our strong support for this constitutional amendment that, as you heard, would create an independent redistricting commission for Rhode Island. One of the things we've heard as we go around and talk about this is that gerrymandering isn't a real problem in Rhode Island. And I think you started to hear some of the stories about the fact that it is a very real problem. So this all really began in the 1960s after the U.S. Supreme Court said that you have to redistrict every 10 years to create districts of equal population, the so-called reapportionment revolution. And from the very start, when the Rhode Island General Assembly tried to do this, it ran into trouble. In 1966, then Governor John Chafee actually vetoed the districts because he believed they were unconstitutional. As you heard from my predecessor, Phil West, in the 1980s, pretty much the preeminent scandal in state government in the early part of the 1980s was the redistricting that happened. And it was because the Senate leadership at the time tried to punish a dissident Democrat and a Republican on the east side of Providence by putting them in the same district. And in the course of doing that, they actually split two neighborhoods. They split Fox Point and they split Mount Hope. They actually took the northern part of Mount Hope and connected it all the way to Lincoln through Pawtucket. And those maps were thrown out by state court, and then the successor map was thrown out by federal court as a violation of the U.S. Voting Rights Act. So we've had a long history of problems with violations of the Voting Rights Act. And then you heard about 2002 and Senator Metz's challenge that cost the state a significant amount of money and ultimately had to be settled out of court because it violated the Voting Rights Act. The proposal before you would take redistricting out of the hands of the legislature and put it in the hands of an independent redistricting commission. And one of the really significant things about independent redistricting commissions is that their maps are three times more likely to be upheld by courts when they're challenged. Almost every map is eventually challenged. There's hundreds of cases of litigation each cycle. But maps that tend to survive tend to be maps that are drawn by bodies that don't have an interest in the outcome, which means bodies that don't include the legislature. You're going to hear later from a political scientist who's going to talk a little more about some of this, but I also want to mention that not only is it just anecdotal and litigation that we hear about, anecdotes and litigation, but also there are quantitative measures of gerrymandering. So we've heard about racial gerrymandering, but there's also partisan gerrymandering. And there have been a couple of cases before the U.S. Supreme Court in the last 2 years on this, and the court has punted. Chief Justice Roberts said it's up to the states to solve the problem. But the case that got to the court in 2018, the plaintiffs developed an actual measure of partisan gerrymandering. And when they took historic maps from the 50 states, they quantified how gerrymandered those maps are. And the 2002 maps for the Rhode Island House were the most partisan gerrymandered maps in the United States by a Democratic legislature. There were more gerrymandered maps by Republican legislatures, but no democratically controlled legislature gerrymandered more than the Rhode Island House did last cycle. So what are we proposing? We're proposing a 15-member commission that would pull the legislature out of the process. It would be chosen in a two-step process. Rhode Islanders would be able to apply to the Secretary of State. Her role would be largely ministerial. She would take people out who don't meet the conflict of interest criteria out of the pool. And then she would do a lottery, just like she does for ballot order. And she would pick out 2 Democrats, 2 people from the largest party, 2 Republicans, 2 people from the second largest party, and 2 unaffiliated voters, bless you. So the initial commission would be 6 people. And then those 6 people would be tasked with choosing the 9 other commissioners. And those 9 other commissioners, again, would be 3 from the Democrats, 3 from the Republicans, 3 unaffiliated. But those would have to meet some criteria that would be in the Constitution around geographic, racial, ethnic, and gender diversity. So we want a panel that's reflective of the state. And then that panel would be given the sole discretion to draw the districts. The assembly would be removed from the process. They would be subject to some transparency criteria. They would have to have at least five meetings prior to drawing districts around the state, one in each county. Then they would, once they came out with the maps, have to do another 5 districts or 5 meetings around the state, at least one in each county. And probably most importantly, they'd be charged with hiring their own staff. Since 1983, Rhode Island's hired the same man to draw our districts. And as you've heard, it hasn't always gone well, right? Kim Brace, who is a very nice fellow, but he's been called the Picasso of gerrymandering. He is the sort of the best consultant money can buy if you want to have somebody gerrymander your districts. And in this case, the commission would be charged with hiring the consultant, presumably not Mr. Brace. So that's how we would try to sort of, as much as we can, wring the partisan politics out of this process. And then as you heard from Phil, also it would put in 7 constitutional criteria. So right now, the Rhode Island Constitution only requires 2 things: equal population and compactness. And we've seen lawsuits fail on challenges to compactness. And certainly equal population you've abided by over the decades. But it creates 7 criteria, and it requires the commission to abide by them in rank order and then state publicly why and how they've abided by them. And this has been very successful in California, because the California Independent Redistricting Commission has had to say, listen, this is how we maintain communities of interest, or this is how we respected historic boundaries for municipalities. So it publicly demands that the commission explain how it drew the maps. So that's the broad outlines of the legislation. As you'll hear, you are going to hear from a variety of groups who support this, and it's not just voting rights or good government groups. It's groups that care about the environment and other issues. You have some written testimony before you. You're going to hear testimony or receive testimony from Treasurer Magaziner, as well as Secretary of State Gorbea. And it's worth mentioning she was also a plaintiff in a parallel suit in 2002. So you're hearing from people who have deep experience with the problem of gerrymandering in the state, who are asking you to put this before the voters and provide them with an alternative before this all begins in 2021. So at that, I am happy to answer any questions you might have about the proposal or my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Marion. Senator Metz.
Yeah, can you go over that? You said there's going to be an initial 6, and then that 6 will pick the 9.
Yes.
So, of course, the district I represent, we want to be in part of that first 6. I don't want to wait till after the 6 are picked, and then hopefully someone picks somebody from the 9. So how are you going to enhance the diversity?
Yeah, so what they've done in California is they've done really robust public outreach campaigns to encourage people to apply. So, for instance, in 2010, 27,000 people applied to be on the commission. And groups like the NAACP and the League of Women Voters and all sorts of groups encourage their members to apply. And so they had a very diverse pool to pick from. The first 6 are chosen randomly so that essentially insiders can't be chosen. That was the method that they decided in California, and we've emulated in this legislation. But then the remaining 9 are chosen by the first 6 because you want to have at least some deliberation, not just randomness, picking all 15 people. You want there to be some deliberative process in picking the balance of the people. So those first 6 are charged in this proposal with picking the remaining 9 while thinking about, do they represent the various communities in our state? Do they represent the various regions in our state? Do they represent different genders, different ethnicities? And so we've seen the model work in other states that are much more diverse than Rhode Island. So California, has dozens and dozens of language minorities. And it came up with a pretty balanced, diverse panel in that state. And we would hope and expect it would do the same here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator McKinney.
Mr. Marion, I'm in favor of the concept. And I probably could have asked this of Mr. West or wait until the political scientist comes up, but I'm just curious. I had seen the 27,000 number in California, and it concerns me that we could just have so much time and effort spent in creating this commission. I am looking at it and wondering whether it's a bit unwieldy and cumbersome, and whether or not there are other models along with California that perhaps could be looked to as alternatives that would achieve the same goal of independence and getting insiders out, as you said, but wouldn't be quite so onerous. It just seems like a long, unwieldy, difficult process to winnow it down to 15 independent commission members.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're right in that it is a complex process. We've looked at various models in other states. Other states do choose different methods. Arizona has retired federal judges who are seen sort of as above the partisan fray. Other states like Iowa kick it to the nonpartisan staff of the legislature to draw the districts. So there are other models, and I'm happy to show you some of those. We sort of spent a lot of time thinking about how you could do this and sort of sufficiently insulate it from the politics. And this seemed to be the best model and one that worked. And so we thought, let's stick with what we've seen work in other states, even though, yeah, I mean, I admit the scale is the big question here. California is 33 million people.
40 million.
40 million people. We're a million and change. Is this scaled too large for us? Maybe it is, but we haven't seen, most of the states that have independent commissions are large populations, so we haven't seen a great model for other places, except for a couple of municipalities. So Austin, Texas has a process somewhat similar to this, and the city of Austin is actually bigger than the state of Rhode Island, but it's a lot closer than the state of California.
Senator McKinney.
I'm just wondering, is there any that you looked at that is a relatively simple process?
Yeah, so typically no, they're not, because if you look at the two other independent commissions in our state constitution, the Ethics Commission and the Judicial Nominating Commission, we essentially just kicked it to the legislature. We said there will be an independent, nonpartisan Judicial Nominating Commission, period, right? We didn't prescribe how to select it. And we've ended up with a statute that we've over the years disagreed with how that's chosen. And so we thought we needed to kind of put in the Constitution this method. But I'm certainly open to suggestions for how to make this simpler but still achieve the same goal.
Thank you.
Senator Lombardi, Rep. Cactus, and then Metz.
Thank you. John, kind of hopping on the conversation you just had with Senator McKinney. First, is this the California model that's being...
It's close. Yeah, okay. Not exact word for word.
Okay. Well, I've been having been elected in 2012, I've been fortunate not to participate up here during a redistricting year. I suspect that with the good luck, maybe I will be. Mm-hmm. But my question is, I'm all for trying to make it as apolitical as possible. But my question, has there ever been a challenge to the makeup of the so-called independent commission itself? So, has there been a challenge? I see at first blush you say 5 members of the most populated party, 5 from the second most popular, and then 5 not. I mean, was there any challenges to that makeup?
In California?
Anywhere.
Yeah, so there's this interesting... Arizona adopted their independent commission. They're the other one that was a big deal last cycle. And there was a challenge that got to the U.S. Supreme Court arguing that the elections clause of the U.S. Constitution doesn't allow an independent commission that was created by a voter initiative. Mm-hmm. And the court, 5-4, said that was okay. But not that I'm aware of that there's been a...
My second question is, how ministerial is the Secretary of State's job in this? Because it seems, to me, at least, pretty substantive that he or she will get the authority to oust potential
Yeah, I
applicants.
mean, so it's not fully ministerial in the sense that, yeah, I guess there's some subjectivity built into, does this person meet the conflict of interest criteria? And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out who that person should be. Some people said it should be the auditor, but I think the auditor doesn't want any more jobs lately.
Especially these days.
So, so California, it is actually the auditor, but the auditor, I think, is an elected position in California. Yeah. Ultimately, somebody's got to apply those criteria.
Okay,
And so
thank you.
we chose the secretary.
Thank you. Senator Reptacket.
John, I was here back in 2002 because I was the famous Steamboat District.
Yes.
My district went from Connecticut all the way to Narragansett Bay, and yet I couldn't represent someone that lived 2,000 feet from my house. That's how ridiculous it was. But I think back then in 2002, we also had downsizing. So I think that played a major role in the problems that were across the state, whether it was the House district or the Senate district. But 2012, when you move forward another 10 years, I don't recall, or did you recall any major issues in the next redistricting? Because I thought that was probably not bad. But what I'm saying is we should also maybe take a look at the good and the bad and maybe see what we did right in 2012 here.
Yeah, so in 2012, there were two significant issues I recall. One was, actually, and we didn't talk about this would give the state, this commission, the power to redraw the congressional lines. We probably won't need to do that in 2022 because we'll only have one member of Congress. But in 2012, to balance for equal population between the first and the second congressional district, they only needed to move a very few voters, but they ended up pulling the entire town of Burrillville and moving it into the second congressional district. And it was in this very room that I remember seeing the staff of Congressman Langevin get very heated when those maps were unveiled. So there were some shenanigans there, and was suggested that that was done to protect Congressman Cicilline in his first re-election against Colonel Doherty. And then there was also this, what became sort of the famous Keeblemander, where Representative Keeble's opponent, Don Fox, was drawn out of the district. His house was drawn right out of the district. They only had to move a couple of hundred people, but they ended up moving thousands in order to sort of prevent his political opponent. There wasn't any successful litigation that cycle. There was a case filed, but they didn't really contest it. But yeah, there have been problems even in 2012.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Senator Metz.
Yeah, and John, when you get a chance, I'd be interested in, if you don't have it today, that's fine, but I'd be interested in looking at the demographics of the state. You mentioned California, compared to the demographics of the commission. Just out of curiosity, I'd like to take a peek at it.
Absolutely. I'll get that to you.
Senator Lombardi.
And John, since you're doing some work for us, do
Okay.
you mind getting us some other models that we can take
Yep.
a look at? Thank you.